Hello, I'm Maciej, Mikos, and you're watching World Talks. For the first time in 6 years, UK's Prime Minister pays a visit to China. What is the purpose of Keir Starmer's trip? We'll talk about it and more with Professor Marc Lanteigne from the Arctic University of Norway. Good evening.
Good evening, thank you.
So Keir Starmer didn't go to China alone. He brought some 50 top businessmen with him. Is this visit then about money and investing in China?
I think this is very much an economics-driven visit. Britain is very anxious to diversify its economic partners. This was part of Prime Minister Starmer's platform from the beginning. And I think the UK is recognizing China as a lucrative market after several years of cooler relations.
Right. Now, Beijing is a very busy place these days. Keir Starmer is visiting only Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo, met with Xi Jinping there, and the Chinese media claim that German Chancellor Friedrich Merz will be the next European leader to travel to China. Now, how would you explain this sudden European diplomatic offensive?
Well, I guess one word to describe it would be a hedging strategy. Many European governments are starting to be concerned about the situation with the United States ever since the latest tariff war began. And they're starting to see China as a much more stable and potentially predictable partner. So it's understandable that China would be potentially more attractive by various governments. And China, meanwhile, has really been trying to portray itself as an alternative for Europe, as a great place to invest, and an area where potential partnerships can be forged.
Right. Now, well, China can indeed offer great business opportunities. It also poses a threat to Europe's security. Now, do you think that this worries the European leaders?
Yeah, many European governments have been concerned, especially over the past few years, with the fact that China, even though it is a rising power, even though it is a great economic power, that there are security concerns, not the least of which ongoing concerns about the Chinese relationship with Russia ever since the full invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So there's a bit of wariness still, but I think there's also the understanding in Europe that the Chinese market cannot be completely ignored.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said that that China tries to portray itself as a more stable partner than the US, but I'm wondering whether these business trips to China could hurt the transatlantic relations Europe holds with the US.
That is a very strong possibility. I mean, look at the diplomatic fallout that we've seen between the United States and Canada in the wake of Prime Minister Carney's economic agreements with China. There is a concern that the United States would also react negatively to deeper economic relations, for example, between Britain and China, as well as other European economies. But nevertheless, it looks like that this is a risk that many governments in Europe are willing to take at this point.
Right. Now, your countryman, if I'm not mistaken, Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, reached an agreement with China last week, which Donald Trump said will result in 100% US tariffs on Canadian goods. Now, how is the situation developing in this regard?
It is difficult. Prime Minister Carney has reiterated that he meant what he said during his speech at Davos, the one that certainly got a lot of attention about the growing role of middle powers and concerns about great power politics. But it also demonstrates that the Canadian government is starting to get concerned about the long-term economic relationship, as well as the health of the free trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So certainly there is a lot of concern in Canada, but there's also the hope that, okay, this might be just a phase that might mitigate over time. But at the same time, mentioning Canada and Europe, Canada is also starting to reach out to Europe and reach out to other economic partners as a way of diversifying its own trade.
So how do you think the whole affair with between Mark Carney and Donald Trump will end?
It's very difficult to tell. The relationship has been up and down. There's been very difficult phases. There's been meetings which have patched things over. There's the possibility of that happening again. But I think one thing that we can say about the American government that it tends to be very, very mercurial when it comes to trade policy, be it with involving Canada or Europe.
Right. Now, we'll change the topic a little. Well, China identifies itself as a near-Arctic state. Now, the US President Donald Trump claims that it would gladly take over Greenland. Now, how accurate do you think are American president's allegations?
Well, for starters, yeah, China's Arctic policy has been developing now for the better part of 20 years. China sees itself as not an Arctic state, but as a regional stakeholder, and it is quite interested in ensuring that its presence, scientific, economic, is felt in the region. Now, one of the justifications, as you point out, that the Trump government has been making in regards to its interest in annexing Greenland is the concern about so-called Russia and China boats off the Greenlandic coast. Now, this despite the fact that China has no military presence in the Arctic off the coast of Greenland, that Russia has also not made that particular part of the Arctic a priority. So where this is coming from is a little unsure. And even if this was the case, even if China and Russia did have specific designs of the waters off of Greenland, the United States already has a military presence there, as does NATO. So any ships getting close to Greenland would be effectively monitored. So yeah, the facts don't really match the rhetoric in this case.
But if they try, could the Chinese do it alone, or do they really need Russia to cooperate with them? Because Russia, for quite a long time, right, for many decades, has been a dominant force in the Arctic. Well,
yeah. Well, Russia certainly has not made any mistake about the fact that it wants to develop its Arctic military capability. That includes ships and submarines. Now, China, it's a bit more of a complicated case. Because China has no Arctic geography, it is very dependent on the goodwill of Russia. There have been joint maneuvers of both the Russian and Chinese Navy, as well as Chinese and Russian Coast Guards. But those have been primarily kind of displays of power. They have not been accomplishing very much other than showing the flag. And China itself still has a very limited capability of sending ships that far north for any kind of independent operations. So for now, one of the big questions is how close is the Sino-Russian Arctic relationship? And for that matter, will Russia be happy with an expanded Chinese military presence in the Arctic in its own backyard?
Right. Now, this winter in Europe is quite harsh. There's a lot of snow and ice and so on. I'm wondering about this northern route, right? The China wants to exploit. Is it absolutely true that it's imminent that this route will open to Chinese ships?
Yes, it's quite windy here in Iceland as well. There's been a lot of optimism about the capabilities of the Arctic Sea Route, the Northern Sea Route between China and Russia. And even though activity has been relatively limited, primarily due to the pandemic, China has started to jumpstart its northern policy. It has started to talk about, again, making use of Russian ports in the Arctic to assist with Chinese cargo runs between Northeast Asia and Northern Europe. But even under current circumstances, even though the Northern Sea Route is going to open up, it is still a very limited sea route. It is still very much prone to everything from floating ice to bad weather. And it remains to be seen at what point this will actually become a serious alternative route to the traditional ones further south.
Right, but could the sheer exploitation of a trade route lead to a military threat for Europe and for the US as well?
The question of monitoring Chinese and Russian vessels, yes, it is a very serious concern, including here in Northern Europe. There are some sea routes, not the least of which being the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, that is seen as a possible expressway for Russian ships and submarines wanting to get from the Arctic to the Atlantic quickly. That is a concern. That's one of the reasons why, for example, the UK and Norway recently signed a strategic agreement which involves keeping an eye on that particular route. And it's also one of the reasons why NATO has started to look at the Arctic much more specifically as a core issue as opposed to peripheral. Certainly, the fact that Russia is building up its Arctic capability and that Russia is starting to be much more assertive in the Arctic is a concern, as well as the fact that, again, China might be partnering with Russia, at least in some endeavors, to establish a better presence there as well.
Now, the Finnish Prime Minister, if I remember correctly, he urged Xi Jinping to end the war in Ukraine, because obviously China has every means to exert its pressure on Moscow to make the war end. Now, do you think that that what Europeans are asking for, will China listen to these? Will China listen to them?
Well, China has put forward a policy officially of neutrality in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has not engaged in any kind of direct weapons trade, but it is still engaging in, for example, energy trade with Russia since 2022. So yes, China is under a great deal of pressure, including from Europe, to work harder to bring an end to the conflict. Now, China is arguing, however, that it is up to the West, including Europe, to stop economic punishment of Russia, which is obviously not something the West is willing to do at this point. So a bit of a stalemate right now. And certainly China is concerned about the long-term economic health of Russia, and whether Russia is still in a position to partner with China, including in Arctic affairs. So I imagine that China will be listening to these kind of European requests, but I don't see a significant shift in China's policy towards Russia in the short term, other than the fact that China is trying to call for some kind of ceasefire, or at least some kind of quick end to the conflict, but not necessarily one that puts Russia at a disadvantage.
So one last question. The trilateral talks between Ukraine, Russia and the US will resume this weekend, if I'm not mistaken. Do you think that that we're about to witness a breakthrough in peace negotiations?
It is very difficult to tell. There seems to be a great deal of distance between Russia and Ukraine on very particular areas, not the least of which being the final disposition of the Donbas region. The Ukrainian government has said that it does not want to see Russia being awarded for its aggression, whereas Russia is essentially saying that it wants to take control of Donbas as part of any kind of peace agreement. So this is a very difficult area. And I'd say the other difficult situation is, okay, what will be the security guarantees for Ukraine after the conflict in order to ensure that Russia is not in a position to threaten Ukraine again? So I'd say, yes, the talks are certainly a sign that movement is being undertaken, but whether an actual agreement can take place, yeah, it still remains to be seen.
Professor Marc Lanteigne from the Arctic University of Norway was our guest this evening. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching, and stay with us for more interviews here on TVP World.